Hi there, Daryl with another Board Gems video. Now last week I covered a game called Alea Jacta Est, which was a dice game that came out in the late 2000s. And I had mentioned in that video that the late 2000s was a really good time to kind of be into dice games because there are lots of great, unique, and interesting dice games that came out starting around 2005, 2006. So what I decided to do this week is cover an earlier dice game. So this was, I think, one of the ones that kind of really, I feel, to my mind, and maybe this is just, history in my mind works a little bit differently than history in real life, but this really kickstarted a lot of the really interesting stuff and stuff that was happening with dice games, and this is one kind of on the forefront of that. We're talking about a game called To Court the King, which was designed by Tom Lehman, came out, like I said, mid-2000s, originally published by Amigo in Germany. It's for 2 to 5 players. The box says ages 10 and up. Younger kids can play. Maybe the first game you probably have to walk them through it a little bit, through the iconography. And the box says 45 minutes. That's really dependent on number of players. So a 2-player game could be as little as 20 to 30 minutes. But I played one 5-player game that took maybe 75 minutes or more. So 45 is probably you're looking at for a 3-player game, or maybe 4-player if you're playing fast. You can get this done in 45 minutes. Like Alea Jacta Est, it had a reprint a couple years ago that added a bit more variety. And in the case of To Court the King, that reprint is Favour of the Pharaoh. Unlike the reprint of Alea Jacta Est, called The Order of the Gilded Compass, that game is basically the same game, just with a little bit more variety added. This changes a lot. It has a lot more variety than To Court the King, but it also changes the design quite a bit. In some ways for the better, but it changes it enough that I'm actually not going to cover this version. And this is only a few years old anyway, like maybe 5 years old tops at the time of recording. So I'm going to go over To Court the King today. I'm going to show you how it plays, and then I'll go over why it's a gem. To set up the game, you're going to get all the cards and set them up kind of in a, not quite a pyramid, but on the backs they show the levels. So that's level 5 and these ones are level 1. So you're going to place them in rows like this. And these are the jokers, the jesters, the fools. Just put them to the side. And there's going to be multiples of most of the types. Of course, there's only going to be one king and queen. That depends on number of players. Check the rule book for that. So the goal of the game is to get the king. The king. To get the king, you need to roll 7 of a kind, but you only start with 3 dice. So the goal of the game is to use your 3 dice to get better and better cards. These cards will allow you to get better dice, more dice, or allow you to change the dice in some ways. The game end triggers when one player gets the king. And then after that, there's a big roll-off. Everybody tries to get the best result possible, 7 of a kind, 8 of a kind, and the highest value possible. And the highest value will be the final person who gets the king, and they will be the winner. So play is clockwise. You got a start player marker here. So on a player's turn, they just take however many dice they start with, which at the beginning is just 3, and they roll them. And if they have any cards, they're allowed to use them. At most, you can use each card once per turn. And you must set aside at least 1 die. So I may set aside the 6. You can set aside more if you want to. And then you roll the rest of them. Again, I have to set aside 1. I'll set aside the 5. I'll roll again, and I have a 4. And so that's my result. Now with that, I can choose to get one of the cards that's visible. Now, if you look at the bottom row, these are the only ones that you can get with 3 dice. This one, and they're all different, I'll walk you through some of them. This one is all odd. All the dice you set aside are odd. All the dice you set aside are even. You have a pair. You have a 3 of a kind. Well, none of those apply. However, this one, 15 plus. That means the sum of the dice has to be at least 15. And sure enough, I have that. So I would take this, the laborer, and I would put it in front of me. Each card has a requirement, the way you get the card, and also a benefit. And in this case, the benefit is, where'd my dice go? This benefit allows me to, anytime during my turn, I can use this card, I execute it, I use it, and I bring in a die of value 1. And I can either set this aside or I can choose to re-roll that if I want to. And I can choose when to bring it in, and I don't even have to bring it in at all if I don't want to. So there's all sorts of different ones. So these ones require you have a certain sum. These ones require you to have like a pair, 3 of a kind, 4 of a kind, of course all the way up to 7 of a kind. Straights, 1 to 5 or 2 to 6. This is of course 1 to 6. Full house, 3 pairs. All odd, all even. There's just some of the possibilities. If you can't get anything on your turn, you get a fool. So you'll see it says 0 plus. And this just allows you to re-roll 1 die. So it's not very good, but it's a consolation prize for bad luck. If you have bad luck again and you were to get a second fool, instead you turn it around and said you have a charlatan, which gives you an extra die. So it helps you stay in the race, so you're getting more dice. After each player has had a turn, and each player will get a card, then this start player marker actually rotates counterclockwise. So the last player to take a turn in the previous round is the first player to take a turn in the next round. And you continue. You can't get the same card twice. You always have to get different cards. Unless it's a fool, and then of course you flip it over as a charlatan. But you're going to continue like that until one player is able to, by rolling and manipulating dice, get 7 of a kind. If they do that, they get the king, and they also get the queen. The queen allows you to bring in a die of any value you want. So they get the queen. They keep the queen, but the king is for now up in the air. The player who gets the king, they note what roll they used to win it. So if they rolled 7 4s, for example, just remember that. They roll 7 4s, that's what got them the king. You still finish the round, so everybody has the same number of turns. And then you have a final roll-off, where each player has one final turn to get a better roll than the player who got the king. So in this case, 7 4s. You can get 7 5s, or 7 6s, or 8 of anything, or 9 of anything. So you do one final turn each, where you try to beat that result. And the best result counts, but it will come back to the player who has the queen, rather, because they're the player who first got the king. So the king can pass around from player to player if each player is able to get successively better results. And finally, it's going to come back around to the player who has the queen. That's the player who first got the king, and they have one final roll to at least tie the best result. And then whoever still has the king after that final roll wins the game. That's pretty much it. You're ready to play to court the king. You know, it can be easier to talk about why you don't like a game than why you like a game. Players who don't like a game are very good at identifying all the reasons why the game doesn't work for them. But if they like it, it's because, well, it's fun. I'm going to talk about some of the perceived shortcomings of To Court the King, and I think it's important to mention them because they are things that a lot of people would potentially have a problem with. For one thing, turns can be very, very long, each individual turn, because you're rolling all your dice, especially later in the game, right? You're rolling all your dice, then you're maybe manipulating some, and you're setting at least one aside. Then you're re-rolling, maybe manipulating them, setting at least one aside. And if you have 6, 7, 8 dice, each turn can take quite a long time. Combine that with the fact that the start player marker actually rotates counterclockwise around the table. So what that means is, for example, in a 4-player game, let's say there's 4 players, A, B, C, and D, okay? I'm A, I do my turn, then I wait for B's turn, C's turn, D's turn, and then, assuming I was a start player, D again before I play again. So there's a lot of downtime, and unfortunately there's not really a lot you can do when it's not your turn. because you basically have to roll your dice and then decide what to do with them. And you don't roll the dice until the start of your turn. So as a result, this game, do not play To Court the King with 5 players. Just don't do it, okay? If you love the game, you can play it with 4. I love the game and I play it with 4. So you're looking at a 2 or 3 player game. But even the 2-player game can feel a tiny bit unsatisfying. And I think it's partly to do with the general. The thing about the general is that it always gets singled out. Because it is probably the single best card in the game, even better than the queen. The queen gives you 1 die of any value. The general gives you 2 dice at the start of your turn. You can't do anything with them. You can't manipulate them. You just get 2 extra dice. But in this game, that feels huge. I don't really think of it as that much of a problem, because the general is the hardest card to get, short of the king and queen. So the way I look at it is, maybe I'm going for the king, 7 of a kind. I can't get it. I just got 6 of a kind, so I get the general as sort of a consolation prize, a very good consolation prize. So my next turn comes around again, if nobody else has the king, I'll get it. Almost certainly I'll get it, because that's such a great card. But because the card is so great, there are perceptions. People kind of voice their concerns about it being imbalanced, because not every player can have a general, right? This is especially true in a 2-player game, because there's only 1 general. So only 1 player is going to get the general, the other player isn't. I have played 2-player games of To Court the King, in which I got the general, and the other player immediately wanted to resign. They were like, oh, you won. We don't have to finish the game. You won, you have the general. Let's play something else, right? I don't see it as that much of a problem compared to other people, but having said that, me and my son, we actually came up with our own little variant. That adjusts the general. And actually, if you look online, you'll see a lot of people have talked about the general and ways that they tweak the general to be more satisfactory within their group. And that's something that I think is really important to say, because there are lots of games that are just average. There are lots of games that are kind of bad even, or they look cool and you play them once or twice and then you see the imbalances, you see the problems in the game. For most of those games, don't play them again, right? You have no desire to play them again. Oh, there's a problem with the game. Well, why would we play a game with this problem when we could play any number of other games instead, right? I would argue the fact that so many people have talked about and worked on their own variants of To Court the King really provides evidence that this game is something. This game is really fun. That it's really, really fun, but has just this one kind of shortcoming. So, but I still want to play the game. I still love the game. Is there any change we can make to remove that? And people talk about it. They want to figure out a way to level out that perceived kind of pitfall, because they love the game and they want to work at it. To make it as good as it can be. So I really think that says something about To Court the King. Something positive. Another perceived shortcoming is that there can be considered to be one way to win. So what you have is you have a bunch of cards on the table. Half the cards give you more dice, and the other half give you ways to change the dice, manipulate the dice. And because it's kind of half and half, when you first enter the game, you feel like you want a bunch of everything, right? Oh, this looks cool, that looks cool, I'll get a bunch of dice, I'll be able to manipulate them, that'll be good. In general, the cards that give you more dice are better than the cards that manipulate dice, in the sense that your ultimate, the result of all the cards you get would ideally be a bunch of cards that give you dice and maybe just a couple that allow you to tweak them. And the reason, because you add more dice, the odds increase that you'll roll and get a good result, or a one result that is good for you. And every time you roll, you only have to set aside 1. So the more dice you roll, the odds increase that you'll get at least one of those values, and you don't have to manipulate anything. It is possible to win the game by just getting dice. Not necessarily. That person would have to be lucky because they'd have to roll and continuously get what they need. So again, the ideal is kind of get a lot of dice and maybe just a couple of cards that manipulate them. But the manipulating cards, the manipulating dice cards, those are the most fun, right? So you want to get a lot of them, but if you get a lot of them, you'll probably lose. Again, perceived shortcoming. I don't really hold it a lot against it. When you're first entering the game, you don't really know much about the game. So you might do that, but the people you're playing with might do that too. But the more you play the game, the more you kind of see the ins and outs. Like, this is good, this is bad. And preferably you're playing with the same group of people and you're all learning at the same time. And so in the end, like my family, we play a 3-player game to Court the King. I would say it's best with 3 players. We all know the game very, very well. We know which cards to go for. We know which cards to kind of, don't worry about it. But every game is still really enjoyable because you have kind of a thing you're working towards. It almost becomes a race to try to get the cards that you want, that are best for the strategy to win. So again, I don't really hold that against it because a lot of games are like that. A lot of games you play once, you don't really know what's going on, but the more you play, the more you learn the ins and outs. The roll-off at the end is fun too. The player who gets the king managed to get a really good result, but everybody else has a chance to beat that. And then it comes back around to the player. Well, are you at least able to tie the best result? So, and that thing is fun. Sometimes at the end you're like, I don't have enough dice to even compete, so I'm out. But it's the end of the game anyway, right? So it doesn't matter. They don't have to sit out for too long. I would probably argue that To Court the King is best with 3 players, and almost only with 3 players. 5 players is right out. 4 players, if you love To Court the King, you won't mind playing it with 4, but make sure there's plenty of table talk and chatting about whatever, because you're going to be bored during the game. And 2 players works fine, but that general, because there's only 1 general, it can feel like a race to get the general, like I said. But I love it for 3. My family loves it for 3. We play it all the time. Let's talk a little bit about the sequel, Favour of the Pharaoh. Now, I'm not going to really review Favour of the Pharaoh. I am going to talk about what's different about the game, what improvements were made. So in Favour of the Pharaoh, the main thing is it comes with more variety. In To Court the King, all the cards show how you get it and what it does. It's all tied together. It's one set. One card is, this is how you get it, and this is what it does. And in Favour of the Pharaoh, they separate those. So every game, there's always the same ways of getting the tiles. There are tiles in the game. But every game, you play with different tiles. And different tiles, in one game, it might be to get, you get 5 of a kind to get this tile, but in the next game, to get that same tile, you might need a full house. Or in the third game, that tile might not even be in it, and there's some other tile instead. So it has a lot of variety. But it also means kind of looking and studying the board, which is good and bad. It's good in the sense that it adds a bit of strategy, because you can look at the board and you can say, okay, ideally I get this tile, which helped me get this, that helped me get this, which helped me get the queen. Of course, the dice don't always cooperate, but you can work on that strategy. And Favour of the Pharaoh is balanced a little bit more in terms of between the players, because in To Court the King, it uses that kind of slightly wonky start player rotation in order to kind of balance the game out a little bit. In Favour of the Pharaoh, they have these tiny little bonuses, which like little one-time use chips that allow you to add a pip or to re-roll a die. And so it balances the game by having the players past the start player get a couple of those. So they have a little bit more manipulation, but not too much, right? So that really balances the game a little bit. There's a lot on paper to like about Favour of the Pharaoh. However, if Favour of the Pharaoh 100% replaced To Court the King, I wouldn't be talking about To Court the King today. I would say To Court the King can stay forgotten. We have Favour of the Pharaoh. That's better in every way. Why do we even need this? I wouldn't be doing a video on it. I'm doing a video on it because I like To Court the King more. In Favor of the Pharaoh, it's all the tiles are like solid primary colors. There's yellow tiles and blue tiles and red tiles. And there might be a slight illustration, but it's mostly like just big icons and a little bit of English. Now that can be a good thing because the iconography in To Court the King might be a little bit confusing. It does come with player aids. But the tiles in Favor of the Pharaoh just look so bland and plain. They're basically just a solid color with some big icons on them. And one disadvantage that comes with having more variety is that because it's still, you have a lot of tiles that do kind of weird and wonky things. But because there's so many different icons, because again, there's so much variety and there's also like dice that you get which are different from the regular dice and stuff like that. So I find looking at it just looks a little dizzying. Like I said, it's bland because it's all primary colors, very little illustration, but all these really weird icons. And you can learn them. They're intuitive. The icons are intuitive. But I just like the presentation of To Court the King more. And there's one big difference. And did you notice it yet? Look at this. Look at this, okay? Right? In the end, if I had to choose between these two games, I choose this. And I'm telling you, it's not just for conserving shelf space. I admit that's a little bit of a part of it, but I do like the presentation of this game more. I like its quirks. Even though Favor of the Pharaoh supposedly fixes a lot of the perceived problems of To Court the King, in the end, my family just keeps playing To Court the King and still tries to tweak this a little bit to make it better for us anyway. So look, if you're interested in the game, I think To Court the King is a little bit expensive to pick up a used copy now. Certainly a new copy would be fairly expensive. It is out of print. This is the new version of it. I still prefer To Court the King. My family still plays To Court the King a lot. We all love the game, and it's a board gem for us. Thanks for watching. Remember, old games like To Court the King don't stop being good just because new games come out. Take care.